Jesus was about to go to the cross to meet his fate. His time on earth was about to come to an end. But he had one final lesson for his beloved disciples, and a wonderful lesson for you and I. What is that lesson, you might ask? It's called loving by serving. Welcome to another edition of Sunday School with the Deek. I am Deacon Wallace Hill IV, proud member of the Mount Pisgah Missionary Baptist Church, where my father, Wallace Hill III, is the pastor. I am happy again to be coming into your living rooms, into your cell phones, into your computers and tablets. And I want to thank you for tuning in each and every week and listening as we break down the Sunday school lessons based on the International Lesson Series. For those of you that are new, do me a favor. Go down to the bottom of the page, hit that little subscribe button, and click that little bell. And each week, you will be notified when the Deek has uploaded another lesson. Again, we grew by another subscriber last week. I'm so happy. That's 2 in the past 2 weeks. And like I said before, I take nothing for granted. You guys give me 45 to 50 minutes of your time every week, and it is highly, highly appreciated. So whoever that was, I want to say thank you, and thank you again. I'm actually recording this lesson on Thursday this week because my producer, Wallace Hill V, shameless plug, my son, of Hillville Digital, has to go out of town. So, you don't know what kind of pressure it is to be under when you got to try to study 17 verses and record it from Monday to Thursday. So it's been a rough week, and still hold a full-time job, by the way. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started. Today we start our today we're actually in our second lesson of our final unit of our fall quarter. Does that make any sense? The unit I told you is called Love, God's Love Amongst Believers. And so this week we're in the book of John. We're gonna have 2 books. We're gonna have 2 lessons out of the book of John. We're gonna have 1 book out of the book of 1 John, and we're gonna have 1 book out of the book of 1 lesson out of the book of Acts. You can tell I'm doing this without editing. And then the last lesson for this final unit of the quarter will be out of the book of James. So this whole quarter has been concentrated on love. And if you have really been trying to get into these lessons, you know that this has been a tough ride. But I'm getting a lot of comments from everybody saying how much these lessons are helping them on love. And I'm telling you, the Deek is a whole lot better person because of these lessons. So today it does not get any easier. I've said for the past month that Jesus is not asking us to do anything that he didn't do. So quite frankly, there's no better example of love than him, because guess what? He is love. This week, we're concentrating on love by serving. And we're in the book of John. And John is known as the simple gospel. You know, the gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And John is not part of the synoptic gospels. Those are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They all kind of tell the same story from different perspectives. John is a little different. This is the same John that wrote this book of John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and the revelation. So why did John write this book? It was the last gospel written, by the way. It was all the other apostles were dead at the time of his writing. And he was the only apostle to die a natural death. Everybody else got killed. So some say that he wrote this to fill in the gaps that the other three gospels had maybe left out. And because the other three gospels deal more with the bodily things of Christ. John deals more of the spiritual things. And see, John was never going to take you to Bethlehem in his writings. His whole mission was to try to grow us as believers. That's why he didn't feel the need to go to the virgin's birth. For this was written to believers, and we believe in the virgin birth. So the Gospel of John is for those who already believe. And John was Jesus's boy. They were so close. So you get a more intimate understanding of Jesus through John's writing. Our lesson today begins in chapter 13. And scholars often reference chapters 13 through 20 as the books of glory, because in these chapters we get to see Jesus in full glory revealed through his death, his resurrection, and his ascension back to heaven. So, as we do every week, let's get set the backdrop of the lesson. We all know this scene as the Last Supper, but they were gathered here for the feast of the Passover. That's what they were eating. And then the Lord's Supper gets instituted in the midst of it. Our lesson today deals with the events that took place while they were there surrounding the table. And so let's jump right into the lesson. Here we go. Verse 1 of chapter 13, the book of John. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world unto the Father, having loved his own, which were in the world, he loved them until the end. So now it says, now before the feast of the Passover. Now the feast of the Passover was instituted as a memorial of the deliverance of the children of Israel out of Egypt. And every year the Jews were required to celebrate it, to remember how God had gotten them out of Egypt. So Jesus knew, it says Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of this world. And many times during his time here on earth, Jesus would say, my hour has not come yet. My hour has not come yet. John 2 and 4, John 7 and 30, John 8 and 20. You always hear Jesus say, my hour has not come yet. When he was at that wedding in Canaan, his first miracle ever performed, his mom asked him to perform a miracle, and he was telling her, Mom, my hour has not come yet. So, but here he says it was his time, his hour had come. And so, you know, I heard many stories of people who were on their deathbed, or people telling about when their relative died, and they said, you know, they knew that they were about to go, and it was something about the way they were talking, or they said that they could tell that the Lord was coming to get them. You know, I don't know if it's just something that God gives you sometimes, but that's different than what we have here, because Jesus, you know, was all-knowing. He knew that it was time for him to go and die. But I just want to throw that in there for free. It says, now, Jesus knew that everything that must be fulfilled had to be done, and now was the time. What was the time? Time for what? To depart to his Father. Now, it was time for him to go back to his Father who had sent him here. Sent him here for the sole purpose of saving the world from an eternal hell. Jesus came to this world for one mission, and that mission had to be accomplished through his dying. Our lesson is called Loving by Serving. And to be honest with you, we don't even have to go any further, because he died for us. Now, how much serving can you do other than that? But anyway, back to the lesson. He knew it was time for him to depart this world and go back to be seated at the right hand of God. And so in close to 24 hours from this verse here, Jesus would be hanging on a cross. So this was the beginning of the end for Jesus. And Jesus used these last precious hours to serve and prepare his disciples. But look at the next part of the verse. It says, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them to the end. And, I'll be honest, a lot of the commentaries that I was reading say he was referring to all those who have accepted him and those who will accept him, which is true. But here in this particular verse, he's referring to his disciples specifically. And so the good thing about it is that regardless if we're talking about the disciples or if we're talking about you and me, the statement is still true. But he loves his own and he loves us to the end. But here today we are going strictly to concentrate on the disciples, because in the very next verse, you'll see how that love is demonstrated. So when he's talking here, he's talking about his disciples. He says he loved them to the end. And the Greek word here for end is telos, T-E-L-O-S. Telos has two meanings, to the fullest degree or to the utmost. And it also means to the end. So the fullest degree shows just how intense Jesus' love was. And to the end means that he did it until his life ended here on earth. Because these were his immediate followers, right? He picked these. God gave them to him. These were his boys. He personally picked them out. They were so close and so intimate with him. Jesus allowed them to be who they were. And he understood each and every one of them. He loved them all differently, but he loved them all. And he gave each of them what they needed. And that's how he is with us, y'all. He understands each and every one of us, and he loves us and gives us everything that we need. He rebuked some of them. He confided with others. He made them some of his closest confidants. And, he loved them unconditionally. He allowed them to be free of who they were. Because, Peter was crazy. And John was his best friend. He just allowed them all to be themselves. And he put up with all their weaknesses. He put up with all their mental and physical weaknesses. He loved them to the end. He truly loved his disciples. And he never took away any of his love from them. He stuck by these fishermen, these little poor fishermen, uneducated fishermen. He never abandoned them for new friends. Now we know they were weak. They were short on knowledge sometimes. They were dull. A lot of them were dull. A lot of them were forgetful because he taught them so much stuff and yet they still forgot. But he never stopped loving them. And he never stopped taking care of them. Let's go to verse 2. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. This is unedited video because my dog is making all kinds of noise here. Nemo, stop. Sorry about that. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. And supper being ended. This was the Jews' way of saying that dinner had begun. Dinner was not over. It had just started. And so have you ever heard of the movie Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? Well, on the surface, it may look like there's only 13 people in this room having this dinner. Jesus plus the 12. But I venture to say we had 14 in this room, and his name was Satan. Satan had slipped into the room where this final gathering was taking place. This Jesus' final intimate moment with his disciples, and Satan has slipped into the room. And the thing that kills me about this is that we so often don't give Satan the credit he deserves. Satan ain't scared of nobody, right? Satan walked straight up to Jesus after he had just got baptized and tempted him, if you remember that. Satan tried to overthrow heaven. You know, Satan told God that Job only loved you because you keep protecting him and you keep blessing him. And now today, Jesus is having his final meal on earth in a nice, intimate setting with his closest friends. And look who decides to invite himself. Satan will enter the room wherever you are at any time. And you know, we find ourselves getting so mad at friends, getting mad at family sometimes. And sometimes it just may be that Satan has entered the room and gotten into somebody. You know, he comes in and he has his eyes set on the disciples. Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Now, I know Simon Iscariot is like, man, why didn't you even put my name in the Bible? Wait, stop mentioning me. But everybody got to know he was my son. Anyway, seriously. The devil had entered the room with his eyes set on Judas to betray Jesus. And no one knew at this point except for Jesus. Judas didn't even know. So he later told John, if you keep reading this chapter, who it was. But here in verse 2, nobody knew who it was but Jesus. So Satan looked for somebody to betray Jesus, and he probably was working on Judas for a long time, but now the choice, the Bible tells us the choice was made, and Judas was his man. The fact that the devil has chosen to tempt Judas in no way relieves Judas from any responsibility for what he did. I just want you to say that right now. The devil tempts everybody, every one of us, every day. But he accomplishes nothing without our cooperation. And so I'm not saying that that resisting temptation is easy, because it's not. But it is to say that we are responsible for our sins, regardless of the fact that Satan tempted us. I just threw that in there for free. Verse 3, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from God, and he went to God. Now, it says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands. I think this part of the verse is very important because of what Jesus was about to do. See, Jesus here, you see here, he knows his authority, because he says he's knowing the Father giving him all things. He knows his authority. He knows where he came from, and he knows where he's going. So here he says, I think it's important for us to know that Jesus knew what he was about to do in verse 4, which we haven't read yet. And not only the next verse, but what's about to happen over the next 24 hours when he goes to die on the cross. So Jesus knew who he was. He knew where he was from, and he knew where he was headed. He was comfortable in his own skin, and this was important for several reasons. And one is important because he says it was his final hour. I mean, the hour had come. You know, Jesus was about to face the agony of crucifixion, the terror of standing in the place of us. He's going to the cross for me and you, and he's about to face it, and he knows he's going there. We're the guilty sinners that ought to be dying, but he's about to go stand in our place and feel the wrath of God the Father as he dies. The righteous wrath, excuse me. So, 2, it was important because of the circumstance that was happening. See, Jesus was about to lower himself, literally stooping in a humble service, which I'm giving you a preview, to his disciples. And so as he served them in this humble way, we need to know that he did not, it wasn't coming from a form of weakness. That's why he opened up this verse in verse 3 saying, Jesus knew that he had all power in his hands. Anything that he needed to do, wanted to do, or could think, even imagine, he could do. And so John wanted to paint the picture so you to know that when he does what he's about to do in the next verse, he did it knowing that he didn't have to do anything other than be God himself. But he put all that aside to do what he's about to do in the next verse. So he did what he was about to do from a position of authority because, as the verse said, the Father had given all things into his hands. And see, when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you don't really find, they don't really tell you Jesus' motives for what he's about to do a lot of times. But here, it's different because John is different. And see, John told us exactly why Jesus, he's going to tell us exactly why Jesus washed their feet and spoke to them with so much love coming in the following chapters. Jesus was his boy. And so I don't know if Jesus, if John asked Jesus about this stuff and Jesus told him, or John just loved him so much that he paid so much attention to him where the other disciples didn't pay as much attention to him. Or I don't know if it's because, Jesus confided in him. So this is why he chose this moment to do what he's about to do. God had given him authority over all things here on earth. So let's see what that thing is that I keep talking about. Verse 4. He riseth from supper and laid aside his garments and took a towel and girded himself. So Jesus got up. He leaves the table in the middle of all that was going on. And if you read Matthew, he gives a little bit more of a understanding of some of the things that happened during this time. Some of the stuff they were discussing around the table. They were arguing about the ointment that had just been poured on Jesus' head. They were arguing about who's going to be first in heaven, who were going to be the first. They were arguing about all of this stuff at the table. Jesus gets up in the middle of everything going on and took off his robe. And as he was doing this, I could see him, see it in my mind, Jesus thinking about what was going to happen to him in the next 24 hours when he's taking off his robe. He's thinking about how he's going to be stripped of his clothing and crucified. But so he takes off his robe, he grabs a towel and he wraps it around his waist. Verse 5. After that, he poureth water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. So before I get into this, I want you to notice how detailed this is written. We always talk about Luke and his detailed writing. John is usually pretty short and succinct in what he says. But here it seems as though John's memory is really vivid and really clear concerning this scene. Like I said, Jesus was John's boy. Jesus, if you look at the book of John, a lot of times he'll say the disciple that Jesus loved. That's how he described himself. He never called himself John. He never said, and Jesus turned to me and said blah, blah, blah. He said Jesus turned to the disciple he loved. He would refer to himself like that because everybody knew they had a really close relationship. So, John, I'm sure, was watching this scene and he can remember it really vividly because this was a really, I don't know what to say, really a kind of scene that really probably amazed him when he saw what was happening. So after wrapping a towel around his waist, Jesus went over to the basin and poured water into it. And mind you, this is only an act reserved for the lowest of servants. Only servants did what Jesus was about to do. So this was a menial task that nobody performed except for slaves. And even then, it was the lowest of the slaves. So Jesus took it a step further. Look what he does next. At this moment of deep meaning, Jesus did something that must have just seemed crazy to everybody. He began to do the job of the lowest servant in the household. He began to wash his disciples' feet. He would wash them, and then he would dry them with the towel that he had girded around his waist. And what you need to understand, due to the lay of the land at the time, the type of shoes that they wore, washing feet was necessary. But it was usually common courtesy for the host to arrange to have a slave to wash the feet of his guests. So here we have the divine host who becomes the slave and performs the lowliest of service. So before I go into why he did this, let me say this. Jesus is headed to the cross, right? We just learned that his hour had come. And so this is a really, really crucial moment in his ministry. And this was the same night in which he was going to be headed to the cross. So he knows all of this. And yet he is still not thinking about himself. I mean, if you think about you and I, what we would be doing if we know in the next 24 hours we would be dying or getting killed. You know, he's thinking about his disciples. He was doing, as verse 1 said, loving them to the end. And even though they knew, even though he knew that these same disciples were going to deny him later, even though they were going to forsake him, he still loved them. So why is he doing this? Two reasons. One, because he knew his hour was coming. He was about to depart and head back to the Father. But second was because of what had just happened in verse 2. Satan had just entered the room and was about to enter into Judas. Now, and Satan may not have stopped with Judas, right? Jesus told Simon Peter in Luke 22 and 31 that Satan has his eyes on y'all and he wants to sift you like wheat. And so Jesus felt it was his job to protect them. So if a wolf comes in and takes one of the flock, it's the shepherd's responsibility to protect the rest. So infection had entered into the room and Jesus was about to apply the antibody. So Judas was one of the 12. So, but he didn't cast away the other 11 because one of them was going to mess up. So he still served his disciples even though there was a Judas in the room. And here's the kicker, y'all. Judas is still in the room and no one has no idea that Satan has entered and has his eyes on Judas. Nobody knows this. Everybody's just going along having dinner but Jesus knows how low he would stoop for those that he loves. And so even though he knew Judas was about to sell him out, he washed Judas's feet. Even though Jesus knew Judas was going to betray him, Jesus still served him. Jesus knew what was in Judas' heart. He knew that the betrayal was coming. Jesus knew the anguish that he was about to go through. The beatings, the scourging, the agonizing walk up that Golgotha hill with the cross on his neck and the crown of thorns around his head. He knew the spear was going to go in his side. The nails was going to go in his hands. He knew, and yet, even in this moment of humbling himself, washing disciples' feet, he still washed Judas's feet. I know it's hard to humble yourself to serve others. I know it's hard to put others' needs before your own. But more than anything, I can't fathom putting a backstabber's needs in front of my own. But if you think about it, that is exactly what we are. We are betrayers, me and you. We are the ones who put Jesus on that cross. It's our sin that put Jesus there. Think about how many times, we've turned from God's grace to live like we want to live or act like we want to act. Or have an attitude that we want to have. To do what we want to do for our own selfish reasons. But Jesus still served us by going to the cross. Even though Jesus knows us, he served us. Even though Jesus knew that I would betray him, he still went to that cross willingly. So I'm telling you, don't be so quick to condemn Judas. Don't be so quick to condemn Jesus for washing Judas's feet. Because guess what? He did it for us as well. Verse 6. Then cometh he to Simon Peter, and Peter said unto him, Lord, dost thou wash my feet? So, as he's going around the room washing their feet, he comes to Simon Peter. And so, when he went to wash Peter's feet, Peter stopped him and was like, and asked Lord, are you planning to wash my feet? And so, as usual, Peter acts as the spokesman for all the disciples. And I'm sure they all feel a little bit of discomfort here in watching what's happening. But until this point, nobody has spoke up, right? And he's already washed some of their feet. I don't know how many he did before he got to Peter. But he gets to Peter. And his question is more of an indignation, right? It's more like, you don't think you're going to wash my feet, do you? Peter's probably thinking, all these other disciples missed the point here by letting Jesus wash their feet. Peter is thinking Jesus wants us to protest. He wants us to say, man, Jesus, you too great to be doing this. We're too unworthy for you to be doing this. You can't be washing our feet. That's what I'm thinking. Peter probably thinking, that's what y'all ought to be saying. That's what Jesus wants us to say. Next verse 7. So Jesus answered and said unto him, what I do thou knowest, not now, but thou shalt know hereafter. Jesus looked Peter in the eyes and said, you don't understand now, but you will one day. Meaning after the resurrection. I want to draw your attention to this verse, though, for us today, because look what Jesus said. He says, what I doest, thou knowest not. And that's the thing about us. We don't know why Jesus do what he does to us. We may question why God does things to us, why God allows certain things in our lives, even when they're bad things. But we too get like Peter and want to interject our own feelings and how we think things ought to be done. But my answer to you is the same one that Jesus gave Peter, because Jesus is all-knowing. And you may not understand it now, but you will in due time. Verse 8. Peter said unto him, thou shalt never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I wash thee not, thou hast no part with me. See, Peter challenged Jesus in verse 6. Now here in verse 8, he gets even harder with his position. He implies that he's not worthy to have Jesus wash his feet, but at the same time, he's defying Jesus, because Jesus told him, look, I'm about to do this. So it's almost the same type of situation. If you remember in the book of Matthew, the 16th chapter, where Peter stated that Jesus, he said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. But when Jesus began to teach the disciples that he was going to die, Peter jumped up and started rebuking Jesus, saying, far be it from you, Lord. This will never be done to you. Peter, a headstrong dude, right? He real headstrong and forceful, acting like he can speak for Jesus and he can control things. But he loved Jesus, don't get me wrong. You know, he didn't become a changed man until after the resurrection. You know, Peter is the one that preached a sermon at the day of Pentecost, and 3,000 people got saved. So although we are unworthy of God's goodness, and although we are unworthy of his blessings, we should never feel like that we can't accept his blessing. And see, that's what Peter was doing here. Sinners may not want to believe how easy it is to be saved. But the Bible is full of good news, and that we're all unworthy of that good news. But I digress. Jesus didn't let Peter slide, though. Don't get me wrong. Jesus responded, if you don't let me wash your feet, then you will have no part of me. And this doesn't mean that Peter wasn't going to be saved. It's real deeper than that. Let's think about Peter for a minute. Peter preached the good news at the kingdom and cast out devils in Jesus' name. And he still needed his feet washed. Peter saw Jesus transfigured in his holy glory with Moses and Elijah, if you remember that. And that was an amazing spiritual experience for Peter. But guess what? He still needed his feet washed. Now, Peter's feet, these very feet we're talking about, walked on water. An amazing act of faith, if you remember. And guess what? He still needed his feet washed. So, most of us look at this situation through the eyes of Peter. This foot washing thing was a powerful lesson in humility, but it was more than that. It also shows that Jesus has no fellowship or no deep connection with those who have not been cleansed by him. Let me let that sink in for a minute. As Christians, you know, we walk through this world and we have a certain amount of filth that we come in contact with along the way. You know, we listen to vulgar language and we talk vulgar language and we look at unholy things and we work with ungodly people and we pick up filth all day, every day. And we need to be constantly cleansed by him. But the more, and we're cleansed by him through this word. And the more we stay away from this word or never let his word talk to us, or never study his word, then it opens up that way for Satan to do to you just what he did to Judas. Verse 9. Simon Peter said unto him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. So look, Peter is hilarious to me. When Jesus told him that he would have no part of him if he didn't let him wash his feet, Peter was like, well, give it all to me. Wash my feet, wash my head, wash everything. He still didn't know what Jesus was talking about, but he did know he wanted to be a part of Jesus. So, but notice this about Peter. He was still trying to stop Jesus from doing what he wanted to do. He told Jesus, don't just wash my feet, wash everything. He's still trying to tell Jesus what to do. But Jesus is not going to allow Peter to dominate this situation. And he's not going to, let Peter set this thing on the wrong course like he always tried to do. You know, Peter had very good intentions, but Peter just don't have a clear understanding of what was going on here. A minute ago, he told Jesus he was doing too much. Now, here in this verse, he's telling him he's doing too little. So sometimes we can show a servant's heart by accepting serving of others. Let me make that again because I want you to hear what I'm saying. Sometimes the way we show a servant's heart is by accepting the service of others to us. You know, if we only serve and we refuse to be served, then that's a sign of pride. It's a deep, hidden pride. And the Bible tells us pride goes right before destruction. And so our humility don't begin with the giving of service. It begins with the readiness to receive service. We can't get up so high, or we can't get so full of ourselves that we feel like we can't be served, right? You know, many people struggle with that. Many people don't want people serving them. But how would you react if Jesus washed your feet? I tend to think a majority of us would be like Peter, if not worse. Verse 10, Jesus said unto them, He that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit. And ye are clean, but not all. King James is hard to read, y'all. This was Jesus' response to Peter after Peter said, wash all of me. He says, he that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit. And in English, I'm going to put it in English. He said, a person who has bathed all over does not need to wash except for the feet to be entirely clean. So instead of trying to make this verse hard, I'm going to do my best to make it super simple. What Jesus is telling Peter here is that the person who has bathed but has walked through like dusty streets and stuff to get to his destination does not require another bath. He just needs to have his feet washed, which is a lot different than cleansing the whole body like Peter's talking about. He's actually giving Peter a compliment here. He's saying, Peter, you've been clean. Now, you only have to have your feet washed. But then he turns to, it says this thing here. I'm getting ahead of myself. So look, on a spiritual level, the person who has bathed, a person who has been saved or cleansed by the blood of Jesus, does not need to get bathed again. He just only needs to have a small washing every now and then. But I need you to pay particularly close attention to the last part of this verse. Jesus said, and you disciples are clean, meaning you guys are all been clean. You don't need to bathe again. I don't need to do all of you. You just need a little cleaning, a little simple cleaning of the feet every now and then. But then he says, but not all of you. This is an allusion to Judas, who Jesus knows is about to betray him. So the last part of this verse goes with the next verse, verse 11. Verse 11 says, for he knew who should betray him, therefore said he, ye are not all clean. So John basically tells us that's why he said in verse 10 that not all of you are clean, because he knew who was going to betray him. And that's why Jesus said it. So Jesus was dropping a little shade on the slide on Judas here. That's why he said they were not all clean, they were all clean, but not all. So you have to remember John is dropping this little nugget on us because he wrote this book after all of this happened, right? So I'm sure he didn't know at the time what Jesus meant, but now as he's writing this book, he can tell you what he meant when he said, you guys are all clean, but not all of you. And this should remind us all that there are some unclean people, right? There was a Judas, unclean as can be, sitting right there in their midst. And so there's going to always be tares among the wheat. There's always going to be goats among the sheep. And there's going to always be foolish virgins with the wise ones. Threw a little Bible in there for you. Verse 12. So after he had washed their feet and had taken his garments and was set down again, he said unto them, know ye what I have done to you? So now that Jesus has finished washing their feet, he needs to take some time to see if they truly understand what he just did. So Jesus has spent his entire ministry as a lesson and an example to them. And so here he needed them to see the lesson in what he had just did. And so the washing of the feet meant something. He was not going to let this moment go by and not make sure they didn't understand what he had just did. Verse 13, he says, you call me Master and Lord, and ye say, well, so I am. And so the disciples often called him Rabbi, or called him teacher, master teacher. Those titles are usually reserved for religious leaders. And Jesus recognized that they understood who he was. And he was their teacher, and he was their Lord. And even though he had just washed their feet, they all understood their place. And Jesus knew his place. Verse 14, if I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. So Jesus says, okay, since we all agree that I am your Lord and Master, and I've showed you how to serve by washing your feet, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And I'm sure if Jesus said, now every one of y'all wash my feet, I'm sure they would have all been on board. They would have all did it. But Jesus didn't ask them to wash his feet. He said, wash one another's feet. And I know that's way different than telling them to wash Jesus' feet. So what if Pastor Hill said, okay, y'all, we're going to do something new at Mount Pisgah. Every third Sunday, we're going to have a foot washing service. How many will be on board? Now let's remember, we just saw Jesus wash the feet of his disciples, and he said that we ought to do the same thing, right? So how many of us will do it? You know, there's churches that perform foot washing ceremonies, but that's exactly what they are, ceremonies. I mean, if you can't stand Sister So-and-so before you wash her feet, I'm sure you're not going to be able to stand her after you wash her feet, right? You know, if you can wash another brother's feet in the right spirit, then by all means do it. But this is bigger than that. It's the spirit of serving that Jesus is trying to get us to see here. It's the humility. It's the love that he's trying to convey. And if there's any deed or any act of kindness or love that we can do for the meanest person on earth, we ought to be willing to do it. You know, we should be servants to God's servants, if that makes any sense. It's easier for us to criticize those with dirty feet than to wash them. You be sitting there like, you see them nails? Ugh, look at them corns. No wonder he walked like that. But that's how the world is. We need to be like Jesus. See, Jesus didn't say nothing, right? He just got up from the table, he filled the basin with water, and he started washing feet. He didn't judge nobody. He didn't condemn nobody. All he was looking for was to restore them and improve whatever issues that they had. And that's what this is symbolic of. It's about, if you've accepted Jesus Christ, you're clean. But sometimes you just need a little washing, right, of the feet. And so, you know, how do we wash ourselves? How do we wash others? With the Word of God. Ephesians 5:26 says that he might sanctify and cleanse it with the washing of water by the Word. Verse 15. For I have given you an example that ye should do as I have done unto you. And Jesus tells these guys, I have given you an example, and you should do as I have done. And I know that can be said about a lot of things when he was here on earth. But look, there's too many of us who profess to be willing to trust Jesus. Trust him as our cleanser. Trust him as the cleanser of our souls. But not nearly the same amount of people are willing to accept his example as a pattern for our life. We accept him, we trust him to cleanse us, but we don't trust him to live the pattern that he set for our lives. I hate to say it, but it's true. So let's try not to be that way. Now, the lesson skips verses 16 through 33 and picks back up at 34. And I do want to call out the fact that in verse 17, Jesus tells the disciples, now that you know these things, God will bless you for doing them. And I'm just here to say that he will bless you if you do these things. If you take his example and you follow his example, Jesus tells you right here, he will bless you. And so now Jesus, after he tells them that, he tells one of them, he says, one of you guys in the room are going to betray me. And it troubled him to say it, but it was true. And they were all needed to know it. And they all started asking, is it I? Is it I? And Jesus secretly told John, the one who dips his bread in the and sops his bread, is the one who's going to betray me. And then Judas dipped his bread, and Satan immediately entered into Judas. And then Jesus looked at Judas and said, go do what you got to do. And as soon as he left the room, Jesus began to tell the remaining disciples that it's time for him to go to God to receive his glory. And he tells them that he's only going to be here for a little while longer. And that's where verse 34 picks up. I'm already at the 50-minute mark, so I got to go. Verse 34 says, a new commandment I give unto you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. He says, a new commandment I've given to you. And this commandment is not entirely new, because Leviticus 19:18 says that you ought to love your neighbor as yourself. But that's not this commandment. Here Jesus is presenting it in a new way, a new fresh way. The new commandment is simple enough for a child to understand, but it's hard or challenging enough for the no mature Christian could ever be able to fully do what he just said here. The command was to love wasn't new, but the extent of the love is new. Jesus had just showed them how to love. He lived his life loving, and he washed their feet. And now he was headed to the cross. So we got to love our neighbors as ourselves, but we're to love our fellow Christians like Christ loved us. And for the record, that's far more than we love ourselves. Verse 35. By this shall all men know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. And so Jesus gives us one form of identification right here. One form of ID. He says the only way that people will know that you belong to me is that you love one another. Don't get me wrong. There are other measures for people to know you're his disciple, but they all come after this one right here. Ignoring this commandment is not an option. Paul told us last week in our lesson that anything you do doesn't mean anything in the eyes of God unless it has love attached to it. So if you don't believe it, go back and watch last week's lesson with the Deek, chapter 13, verses 1 through 13. So just to reiterate, Jesus makes us his disciples Jesus marks us as his disciples by our love for one another. We can mark ourselves as his disciples for our love for one another. And the world can mark us as his disciples by our love for one another. And so that's the end of the lesson. And I'm not even going to try to do some takeaways as I do every week. But I think this lesson on love spoke for itself. Our job is to serve one another. Take every opportunity you can to serve your brother or sister. I needed this lesson years ago, but hey, this is why people don't like the word of God, because when you know better, you got to do better. And remember, Jesus washed Judas's feet. And if he can do that knowing that what Judas was about to do, you should be able to do it for anybody. So be blessed. I love you. Because I want to be known as a child of the King. So I love you. So next week's lesson will be in the book of John again, chapter 15, verses 4 through 17. The lesson is entitled Abiding Love. So, okay, here is another lesson. And as we say every week, may the Lord watch between me and thee while we're absent one from another. Amen. Sunday School with the Deek. Sorry it was so long.